if you can find a reorientation for the ego of that person, then there's always a way into the positive side of the archetype. You know, I mean, from a male perspective, it's a bit like in was it Moby Dick, where Ahab's there, and it's hard to think of anybody a bit more negative than that. And but he still talks about the theoretic bright side. You know, is what he talks about. So it's always there, but can you connect with it? You know, is the question. So that's I suppose, the paradox of it. You know, so if you've been badly mothered yourself, how do you forgive your own personal mother, or that pattern of behaviour that she has, wittingly or not, you know, inculcated or encouraged or whatever the word is. But if you can find it in yourself to maybe forgive or find some other way of reconnecting, not so much with, or I suppose finding compassion for the personal mother allows you to reconnect with the archetypal mother or the archetypal pattern. And so there can be a reaching beyond just your personal history to something which is, you know, greater and more continuing on, you know. So, that's the hope.
Yes. Yeah. You can see where that could be very controversial though, when you're talking about some, you know, psychosis especially, and how we often just see psychosis as something that's, use people as manic psychotics, and, you know, observe people and don't really lock them up maybe.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the sort of the, what's the word? I mean, yeah, and from one point of view, that's the great tragedy on our current perspective on it, is the amount of creativity and the amount of the cultural wealth that's lost through that kind of approach. You know, if because one of the Jungian ideas along those lines is that that the idea that if you repress your creativity, you can come out as madness, or from the other side, madness is only repressed creativity. I think you've got to be a bit more careful with going the other way. But I think there's still a great deal of truth. You're in the same stuff of the archetypal psyche. The only difference is the creative person sort of is able to let it out into a sort of a controlled space or a safe space, whereas the poor people on the street who are just spouting stuff, they haven't got a sort of a container to put it in, you know. So it's not so much, in a sense, what you say or what you do, but who you tell or where you put it, you know. from that perspective. So, but I think even in terms of, I think it's possible to go beyond a point where it's just therapy and to a point where it's actually creating something of cultural value. You know? But the trouble is, in our education system, we're not taught that the other side of that, if you like, horrifying, or that sort of what's judged as madness, can also be the creativity thing. It's not one or the other. And by squashing one, you squash the other. You know, you squash them both because they're essentially the same thing. Yeah. Well, it's a bit like Joe Campbell, who's sort of along the same lines as Jung. He says the only difference between the sage and the madman is the sage knows how to swim in those waters. You know, because you're in the same stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think my experiences working in mental health have been, I actually believe people choose to become psychotic.
Yeah, I think at some level, yeah, I think so.
I
It's sort of a way out, or
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's that fine line of, you know, they kind of sit on a fence for a while and see whether they can cope with the world, or whether in fact it's too much and I'm just going to lean that way. And if you probably strengthen
I think
world.
Yeah, and perhaps the trouble with getting back to what you're saying about the chemicals and the treatment at the moment, the problem with that worldview is not that it opposes the two, because sometimes that's absolutely necessary to preserve your sort of keeping the peace and people's expectations in a social sense or a legal sense. So at times it's absolutely necessary, but it's not always a sort of zero-sum opposition. Instead of just sitting on the fence, there can also be this sort of opening out possibility where that madness stuff gets put into acting or into any kind of art form that provides, if you like, sort of almost like a space where the fence sort of opens out into a bit of a circle there, and there's a cultural space or a safe space where that stuff can be expressed in a socially understandable form. So if you look at like Buto or something like that, it's the same kind of very intense bodily reaction that you might see in somebody in a sort of almost catatonic type of, you know, muscle, go, carry on. But it's the same kind of stuff put into an artistic form. And so it doesn't need to be something that we need to stamp out with the chemicals or the judgment or whatever, but if people undergoing the experience knew that it doesn't have to be one side of the fence or the other, but it can actually be an opening out into almost like a nest or something, you know?
I think that depends though, doesn't it? I mean, for people that can't kind of, you know, construct for themselves a workable kind of view of reality, I mean, a lot of people really suffer.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
but
there's
I
a
think,
lot of negative things about it.
Oh yeah,
as well.
yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. But I think and you're right, it's up to the individual to construct that for themselves in a sort of final sense, yeah. But at the same time, I think part of the problem is that, looking at it from a medical or educational point of view, is that the people who are, quote unquote, you know, in charge, whether it's the doctor or the teacher or whatever, it tends to be this sort of, you know, this or that, black and white type thing, instead of being able to find that space in the middle. It's both. And if we were taught in school or in hospital or by your GP or whatever it is, okay, you've got this stuff coming up, we can see it in the dreams, let's find a container for it, let's find a space where it can become both other or madness or whatever you want to call that, and socially acceptable at the same time. So if you can find that space, then it doesn't have to be an opposition, it can actually be a union, and that enriches both. I think it enriches the unconscious, because Jung sort of says the unconscious shows to us the face that we show to it. So if you're creating a space where the unconscious can come in through your everyday life, then, and it's also giving something back to society as well, you know, an insight or a kind of performance or whatever it is that people haven't seen before. You know, it's a great cultural enrichment. And that I think is the great pity of a general response at the moment. Now, it is still true, I think, that sometimes, okay, that's, like you're saying, people that really can't find a way of finding that space, perhaps you do have to have recourse to that in certain cases.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I think there's quite a number that, if they were given these tools, and if those tools became a sort of a mainstream rather than a sort of esoteric, you know, backyard, whatever, you know, by street, then I think there's quite a number there that really could contribute to the richness of your everyday society and everyday life. It doesn't have to be that black and white. But anyway, I think that's kind of the potential that this work has, because it's sort of showing in those quantitative, socially acceptable terms, pardon me, that this other stuff isn't all bad. That the stuff that the postnatal psychosis woman is going through is the same stuff that a happy mother is going through. You know, it's the same stuff, but it's just the other side of it.